Good afternoon and welcome to our Empowered Communities Employee Town Hall with our special guests, Congressmember Zoe Lofgren, who probably has more Bloom Energy employees in her district than anywhere else in California, and our founder, CEO, and board chair, Dr. KR Sridhar. Again, thank you for joining us. This is also on Facebook Live streaming, and we always like to let people know when they are being recorded and streamed on Facebook Live. My name is Carl Guardino. I have the pleasure of serving Bloom Energy on our Government Affairs, Sustainability, and Policy team, and we appreciate each of you joining us today for this hour-long Empowered Communities Employee Town Hall. With that, I'd like to ask my colleague, Jimmy Apfel, to take himself off of mute, place himself on camera to introduce our very special guest, Congressmember Zoe Lofgren. Jimmy?
Thank you, Carl. It is my pleasure to introduce Representative Zoe Lofgren, a lifelong Bay Area resident. After graduating from Stanford and the Santa Clara University School of Law, Congressmember Lofgren's career began at the local level, serving on the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors before being elected to the House of Representatives in 1994. As a former immigration attorney and professor, Congressmember Lofgren has been deeply committed to issues around immigration reform, and she was recognized by then Speaker Nancy Pelosi for her work in passing the DREAM Act through the House in 2010. Congressmember Lofgren's other priorities include supporting digital rights, expanding internet access, net neutrality, and fighting unwarranted government surveillance. Currently, Representative Lofgren serves as the chair of the California Democratic Congressional Delegation, chair of the Committee on House Administration, and is a member of the Committee of the Judiciary and the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Representative Zoe Lofgren.
Thanks so much.
We are honored to have you with us. Dr. Sridhar, KR, thank you for carving out time to join us as well. I will remind our colleagues at Bloom Energy that our employee town halls are divided into three portions. First, I have the pleasure of asking two incredibly smart, articulate people 4 or 5 questions, and we'll rotate who responds first so that neither of you feels that I'm picking on you for always having to go first. That's something I learned as one of 4 sons, not having to always answer first. Second is what we lovingly call our lightning round, 7 or 8 quick questions with 1 word to 1 sentence responses. And then the third segment, my favorite portion, and that's where we get to hear from smart, caring Bloom Energy employees with their questions. They can place those questions in the chat box. Often people text to my phone at 408-838-4848, or any other way that you want to communicate that you have a question. We'll get to as many employee questions as we can. With that, let's start with segment 1 and a handful of questions that we'll ask Congressmember Lofgren to respond first, and then to KR. Question 1. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, which had been also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, was signed into law last fall. It includes nearly $60 billion for clean energy investments in development, modernization, and resilience. Can you elaborate on how this money will be invested and what the steps are for getting that funding to state and local governments as efficiently and effectively as possible? Again, we'll start with Representative Lofgren.
Well, thanks so much, Carl. I think it's worth noting that this infrastructure bill is the largest investment in clean energy in the history of the United States. So it's really a significant step forward. I will note that the investments are in certain categories: delivering clean power, clean energy demonstrations, efficiency and weatherization, that would be for buildings, homes, and communities, as well as funding for clean energy manufacturing and workforce development, which is also important. Now, it's going to be up to state and local governments as well as other partners to actually apply for most of these funds. In January and February, the White House put out very detailed sort of resource outlines. And I have actually put that on my own website and tweeted it out and Facebook and the like on how you get the funds to do the innovation that we're expecting. Some of the application periods have already begun. Others will begin later in the year. And I'm going to do everything I can, along with other members of Congress here in the South Bay, to be promoting the proposals that are made here locally, whether it's by universities, governments, nonprofits, or even businesses. So that's the way it's going to go. And I really do think something this big and this significant has the capacity to really change our future. And we know with our climate change predictions that that is an emergency.
Representative Lofgren, thank you. KR, from your perspective?
Thank you, Carl. And for our employees, on behalf of our employees, let me welcome Congresswoman Lofgren. We are so fortunate to have you representing us. And for those of you that don't know, she is my idol in the House when it comes to immigration reform. She is so passionate. There is not an opportunity where she does not try to promote and push meaningful immigration reform in this country, which we all know we badly need. And it's about the human element that she focuses so well, for which we are all grateful that she represents us. In her response to Carl's question just now, what you heard there is human development, human infrastructure is an important part of infrastructure. How do we build workforce? And how do we create the welfare of that workforce? And how do we create societies that are going to be resilient to this digital, to the climate change, while adapting to the digital transformation that's happening? There are two big transformations that are occurring. The digital transformation, making everything require energy very reliably, cleanly, and more of that energy. But climate, making us want that abundance of energy without harming the environment. So it is an issue of an and of how do we create those two things for a modern world. And this infrastructure bill couldn't come at a better time. So I would say focusing on let America lead. So made in America, promote local, number one. Number two is it needs to be resilient, it needs to be inclusive, it needs to be sustainable. Number three, making sure we are not putting the infrastructure money into the old infrastructure that cannot adapt to the future, but into the new infrastructure that will take us to a better place.
That's right.
KR, thank you. Our second question, and we'll ask KR to respond first. As work continues in Congress to build on the success of IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, can you give us an insight into when we get to Congressmember Lofgren, the priorities in the House and what work is currently underway to meet the nation's climate and energy goals? And KR, what kind of support do you think the private sector needs to help further ensure that America has a clean, resilient energy economy? KR, we'll start with you.
So if we just look at traditionally how new technology has come in, how policy has helped the market adopt new technologies, and the countries that adopt those new technologies first become the leaders in that space and then create an enormous amount of wealth in the economy by exporting it to everybody in the world, right? That's the formula. So this should be no different from what is well-proven American policy and American capitalism and American society working together for the greater good of everybody. So if I think about it from that perspective, creating these incentives in the marketplace that signal long-term market certainty is going to enable private capital to come in and add to what the government is doing. That's number one. Number two, creating the environment for those technologies to be adopted, to be brought into the marketplace, and removing the barriers without creating technology winners and losers. Okay, technology neutral. If we did those two things, the companies that really need to succeed will succeed, and the ones that don't shouldn't. Carl, you're on mute.
Well said, KR. Congressmember Lofgren?
Well, I can't disagree. And if KR will call me Zoe, I'll call him KR. The Build Back Better Act that the House of Representatives passed really, I think, developed along those lines. And as we know, that got stuck in the Senate, but it did provide, the government doesn't replace capitalism. I mean, it's the private sector that moves forward in the market, but there's some things you can do that allow for that development to be expedited. For example, which comes first, the electric charging stations or the electric cars? I mean, the infrastructure for electric charging stations is a heavy lift, and really to provide some incentives for that is going to spur development in an area that would be very helpful. We had a lot of investments that we don't know. Senator Manchin, as you know, it's a 50-50 Senate with the vice president breaking the tie. We're not getting support on the Republican side of the aisle. And so any Democratic senator has a veto, and he exercised that, but we are still working with him in the hopes that we can do something useful. I want to mention something else that has passed both the House and the Senate, and that's the American Competes Act. Now, there are different versions in the House and Senate. So we have a conference committee. I've been named one of the conferees, and there are some significant differences, which I expect will be compromised in a very useful way. But it is a huge package that invests against climate change by supporting, really, it's a research bill, advanced energy storage, solar, hydrogen, critical materials, carbon removal, bioenergy technologies, and it's the heavy emphasis on research, which is why the Science Committee was the major committee of jurisdiction. I personally worked with others to make sure that, and this is science now, it's not energy development, but that we maintain our support for fusion research, because we know just last August, we had a critical moment at Lawrence Livermore National Lab just up the road where they got ignition for the first time on August 8th. And okay, that's science, it's not energy, but if you don't sustain your science research, the later development is never going to occur. So it's important that we take the long view on that. And as I contemplate my role as a conferee, I just want to mention one thing that I actually got included in the bill, which was provisions to allow scientists who want to come and be Americans to do so. We have a provision in the bill that if you got your PhD in a STEM field from a research university or its equivalent outside the United States, you can get a green card. And I think that's, you want to do science research, you need scientists. And we don't want to be turning the scientists who could be part of our brain trust to other countries. And we have a few other bells and whistles in that regard, but I think it's a very important component of the bill.
Excellent.
So I think maintaining both that startup visa provision as well as the removing the caps on the PhDs and masters for STEM, those two being in that competes bill is going to be so huge for this country, and you are the best conferee to protect those provisions in the bill.
Well,
so
thank you. I think it's important we try and put it in the bill because when I did the startup visa, and there were Republicans who privately told me they were for it, but I couldn't talk a single one of them to publicly co-sponsor the bill. So I know there are people who agree, but they're afraid to put their name on it. So maybe we can move those forward as part of Competes.
Excellent. Thank you, Representative Lofgren. Both of you have mentioned resiliency, so let's build on that point. As California's historic drought continues and we enter another hot and dry summer, wildfires, rolling blackouts, PSPS events like the one that hit our home in 2019 will be a constant threat to our communities and our environment. How can California leverage its strengths to best adapt to, mitigate, and overcome this particular outcome of climate change? Let's start with Representative Lofgren and then KR.
Well, as this has been a topic of tremendous interest among the California Democratic delegation and the Science Committee, where I'm the next most senior member. As a matter of fact, we have advocated funding that has gone through the House, and we just got noticed yesterday that California will get $28.6 million for wildfire prevention, which is very helpful. And I want to specifically mention Speaker Pelosi, but also Senator Padilla, who has been very, very active in this space. I've authored a number of bills, one that just passed by voice vote in the Science Committee. There are things we can do using science and technology to make ourselves less vulnerable. For example, we don't have good satellite imagery down to a very tiny spot on the planet at this point that's accessible to the fire community. We've got defense material, but there are issues in terms of releasing some of that classified information. So, if you can find a fire that's starting when it's little, you have an opportunity to put it out before it grows, number one. There's also technology for fighting fires. For example, NASA Ames has developed a whole series of firefighting drones. There are times when planes can't safely fly to put out a fire because of weather or smoke or the like. Well, that doesn't bother the drones. They can be sent out anyhow. There are a lot of other things in terms of I grew up with Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires. Well, everybody thought they were doing the right thing, but now we have this tremendous backlog of fuel in the federal forests. It's mostly federal forests. And that you can't just set a fire as would have happened, 800 years ago, where the fire cleans out the underbrush because there's too much fuel that has been built up. And so we need fuel reduction to prevent big wildfires. And I'll tell you also something I didn't know until I started working on this. There is a cap on federal firefighters' pay. So once they reach that cap, they either have to stop working or work for free. Now we got that lifted, but Senator Padilla and I have a bill to permanently eliminate it. We've also, I secured funding through the member appropriations process for the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center at San Jose State, which is working with a whole variety of both federal, state, and nonprofits on wildfire research. So there's a lot going on, but we know we're at risk. Boy, when the wind kicked up earlier this week, I thought, let's just pray there's no fire, because we're dealing with climate change that has increased the risks exponentially.
And as we go to KR in just a moment, I just would remind all of us, the summer of 2020, the acreage that burned in California was larger than the entire states of Massachusetts and Delaware. The loss of life, the loss of property, the loss of nature is just tremendous. KR?
So everything Zoe said, if you put that in one bucket, it's about adaptation technologies. We've been focused for a while now on how to fight climate change for the long term, which is how to get to the decarbonization situation. We are unfortunately in a place where the effects of climate change are already happening. And we need, in addition to the long-term solution, we need adaptation between now and the time that we need to be, because we are going to have to live with this for the next few decades, no matter what we did with the climate globally. Because we can't take back the CO2 at a rate that it's already in the atmosphere. So that adaptation calls for putting resiliency at the top of every thought process when it comes to public health and protecting property. So when you go that way, if it's not going to be wildfire, it's going to be heat, it's going to be drought, it's going to be other things. And we live in an earthquake country. And it's going to be man-made, cyber attacks on our large infrastructures. So it all points to, we need to do an and the and is adaptation technologies and resiliency technologies, protecting critical infrastructure. And the transition is going to be necessarily decades long, even if we are as ambitious as we can be because of the size of the problem that we are trying to fight. So that would say that we shouldn't do knee-jerk reactions like what Germany and Japan did, of shutting down a nuclear power plant that's completely operational. Yeah. And creating more of a problem and then figuring out how those lives lost could have been protected. Why? Because we are not adding to the nuclear waste issue on an existing nuclear power plant. Similarly, we shouldn't be stopping the pipelines that already exist from passing the gas, but we should be figuring out how to reduce the leakage in those gas. Thereby, we give energy security to the people. And figuring out how to make that molecule inside the gas green by bringing in hydrogen and biogas and things like that, rather than natural gas. So it is going to take a different mindset than every fossil fuel is instantly going to get replaced by renewables only, because that's not practically possible.
KR, let's stay with you for a moment and dig even deeper on public safety power shutoff events. When the grid reflexively shuts down during periods of instability, this has become increasingly common in California, leaving tens of thousands in darkness. KR, can you build on what you've already said on new technologies that help harden our grid and reduce the frequency of these PSPS events? And then Congressmember Lofgren, what are you hearing from your constituents regarding these blackouts? And I'm building on that because I remember August of 2020, I think it was August 13th and 14th, one of every 5 San Jose residents was without power for 2 full days during a heat wave. KR?
So for many of our employees who have joined new, and that's a good thing, so during COVID, we added 60% to our workforce. We have more than 300 job openings right now. And many of these are manufacturing jobs. I mean, jobs that after high school graduation, if you're motivated, you get paid good money, you get full medical benefits. So we are very proud of what we are doing, not just with our technology and what we bring, but with the people, but many of them are news. So even for them, it'll be news. Going back to that August 2020, Carl, that you referred to, is when the fires in the Napa Valley and Santa Rosa area were very large. I won't name the customer because I don't know whether we have the permission or not, but it was a very large medical, in the field of medicine. And during COVID, they had to keep operating, and they were asked to evacuate. The grid went down. There are 2 buildings that need to stay running. One had backup diesel, and on one, just a few months earlier, we had put our bloom boxes. And the factory, they had to evacuate the people because the fire was within half a mile. But keeping that factory running meant that when they came back in, if the fire didn't come, they could just continue production. If they shut it down, it'll be weeks and months to get it started. The second building where the backup generators were, they had to shut it down because they can't operate a backup generator without people watching it with the fuel stored out there. It was a hazard. They reached out to us and said, what about the building that you're powering? We said, just leave it on. They said, why? We said, the moment it comes somewhere close, we can remotely monitor it, control it, shut it down. It'll be safe. There'll be no issues. But let's all pray that the fire doesn't get to your property, in which case we'll have the building running. And sure enough, we just monitored. The fire came up to the parking lot, did not come to the building. Within 2 days, they were able to get that building up and running and do what they needed to do. So how many lives can be saved if hospitals operated that way, if essential services operated that way? That is what modern technology can do. We know how to do this. We just need to be given a level playing field in the marketplace and the right incentives to be able to bring this to the people.
Great example, KR. Thank you. Representative Lofgren?
Well, I think it's not a surprise to hear that my constituents don't like it when the power gets shut off. And I think there is a fair amount of anger at PG&E, the regulated utility in Northern California. And I think that's justified. I mean, they made substantial profits that they never plowed back into modernizing their system. There's a reason why, as a corporation, they were found guilty of criminal activity. So there's that. I do think there's technology to harden the grid, which they have not utilized. It's interesting, as many of you know, the district that I'm representing will be somewhat altered after the election. I have a new section in my district south of Santa Clara County. And so I've been going down to really fairly small towns in the Monterey County area and getting to meet people, hearing their concerns. Even small towns are talking about creating a microgrid so that they have some resilience. So people have caught on that the old way of doing it is not going to sustain us. But I do think alternative energy in terms of the antiquated system has to be first of mind. I talked to some people who have a small clinic in a small town, and they're worried about losing power, and they're thinking diesel generators. Well, actually, they'd be better off with solar powers and batteries. It would be at least as resilient, at least as long, and less polluting. And of course, I remember going down to, I won't mention the name, but it was a business in the 19th Congressional District, and power was being turned off. And I said, well, what are you worried about? And they pointed out the window and said, we're not worried, we got Bloom boxes. So there's that as well.
Thank you, Representative Lofgren. If it's okay with you both, I'm going to switch a bit from policy to professional and personal with my last question before we go into our lightning round. And my last question is, working at the highest levels, Congressmember Lofgren, in your case, in the United States House of Representatives, KR as CEO, founder, and chair of Bloom Energy, what's something you've learned about leading large and diverse organizations in a successful way? And Congressmember Lofgren, let's start with you.
Well, define the organization. I lead the California Democratic delegation. It's the most diverse delegation in the United States. And the key is to understand, I'm not in charge of them. I'm actually helping us reach consensus to move forward. So as someone said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen, and then build consensus. I'm the mayor of Capitol Hill as chair of the House Administration Committee. So that is a very diverse workforce, including technology people. We've got people cleaning staff, we've got architects. So it's a very different staff. And I think the thing there is to listen, have a plan, that reflects the capabilities of the workforce, be clear about expectations, be fair about the treatment of employees. And then there's the House of Representatives writ large. And I really have not had tremendous success in leading some of the more extreme Republicans. But I have had bipartisan bills that I've written. And the key to that is to reach out in a way that's respectful, that is issue oriented, and to work together collaboratively and respectfully to achieve a goal. And that has worked for me pretty well.
Listen, be clear, be fair. Thank you, Representative Lofgren. KR?
They're wonderful takeaways, Zoe, and I'll just add to that. For us, with a large organization, open communication and more communication becomes the key. Because oftentimes problems arise because of lack of communication, or worse still, miscommunication. So that constantly figuring out how to be better at communicating and better at communicating timely and accurately becomes important. But from a values perspective, if every employee feels included, diversity is not good if inclusion is not there. To me, I don't like talking about diversity without inclusion. So as long as the inclusion is there and people are inspired and feel ownership to the company, that's it. Then everything else falls in place.
Truly well said. My thanks to you both that we can go from the professional to a little bit more personal about your leadership styles and effectiveness. We're going to now go to segment 2, which again is our lightning round of 8 quick questions with 1 word to 1 sentence responses. And we're going to start with Representative Lofgren. What's your favorite family tradition?
Oh, well, Thanksgiving is my favorite. I always cook dinner for the entire extended family and won a blue ribbon for my pecan pie.
If you need a second opinion on that pecan pie, you know my home address. That is really terrific. I didn't know about the pecan pie. KR Sridhar, favorite family tradition?
Well, it happens every night. Family dinner, honestly. That's a tradition. I try not to find any excuse to not go home in time for like dinner, and that helps.
What a wonderful tradition. Ours is on Sunday night, where we go and get my mom, bring her home, and take her back afterwards. And I promised her this Sunday night will include Zoe Lofgren's pecan pie. Let's go to our second lightning round question, starting with KR. When you are walking into a challenging situation, planning for a challenging situation, is there a song that inspires you as you prepare yourself?
I'm going to give you the one-line answer, but you're going to ask me. I bet you would want me to explain what it is. It's called Sirius by Alan Parsons Project. Does that mean anything to either one of you? No, if it doesn't, please. It won't. Okay. So this is going to be a run on sentences, Carl, but it's because you don't understand the answer. This is the song that the Chicago Bulls used to play introducing the team all 6 seasons when they won the world championships. So growing up, being in Illinois at that time and being a big Chicago Bulls fan, if you heard that playing in the arena, it meant 2 things. You, the home team, are going to win, and whoever is showing up better be better be prepared to lose. And to me, that's that song always stays in my head. If I'm going to walk into a room, I'm going to hum that tune, and there you go.
And Ed Havel of Bloom Energy just put into the chat, great song, exclamation point, ties into Eye in the Sky on the album.
Yeah, exactly.
It just shows that you and Ed Havel are a lot more hip than I am. Congressmember Lofgren, is there a song?
Well, not really. I don't like to mix my music and my work. So really what I need going into a challenging situation is several cups of coffee prior to walking in.
That's great. Congressmember Lofgren, we'll start with you with our third lightning round question. Who would play you in your future bio picture?
Well, I have no idea, but wouldn't everybody say Meryl Streep?
Who can play any of us at any time? That's great. KR Sridhar, who would play you?
I'm just busy acting my own role in my real life. I'm not thinking about that.
KR, what was your first job?
I worked in an automotive shop as a mechanic in high school.
And Zoe Lofgren?
Well, I mean, as a kid, I did babysitting. I ironed shirts, 10 cents a shirt. But my real on a payroll job, I worked the night shift at the Eastman Kodak processing plant, then in Palo Alto, starting in my in high school. It was 7 in the evening to 3:30 in the morning, with a limit of 2 hours of overtime, because in the state of California, women could not be asked to, well, I was a girl, not a woman, but more than 2 hours at night. So that was a hideous job, and reinforced my desire to not spend my life in the Eastman Kodak packing plant.
Amazing. And Zoe, could you remind us, Palo Alto at that time was a different community.
No
Could
kidding.
you remind us what your parents did for a living?
Oh, sure.
Raising you in Palo Alto?
My father was a local he was a beer truck driver, local delivery. My mother worked, she was a cook at the Cumberly High School cafeteria and later a secretary. It was a completely blue collar neighborhood. There wasn't a single person on the block that I grew up on in South Palo Alto who'd gone to college. Everybody had been in World War II. Everybody bought their house for $9,000 with a VA home loan. Everybody had kids after, and it was completely, now it's so expensive. And I'll bet you there's no truck drivers, beer truck drivers living in Palo Alto today.
That is an amazing reminder of the diversity of incomes that used to reflect this valley and all of its communities. Zoe, we'll start with you. If you could live in any city in the world for a year, where would you live?
Well, I think I have to say San Jose, because I have to spend part of my time in DC.
Well, we'll assume that San Jose, California, and not San Jose, Costa Rica.
California.
Good. KR?
So I'm assuming outside of where we live, and I would pick Rome.
Wonderful. KR, back to you. Do you collect anything?
Memories.
Well said. Representative Lofgren?
Well, I'm kind of a hoarder. I've got all kinds of political buttons, but it's my husband who has the wonderful book collection.
That's great. And I saw one of the books in the background says Marshall, which of course, John Marshall Collins is your husband. My next question, what has made you smile recently? So?
Well, my daughter had a baby a month ago, and that little guy certainly made me smile over the weekend.
That's wonderful. KR?
Just waking up this week and watching the rain.
Yes, that was nice on Monday morning. KR, you have our last lightning round question. If you could pick up a new skill in an instant, what would it be?
Playing the piano.
Great. And Zoe, new skill.
Well, I've got to do two. If I could do teleportation and avoid United Airlines, I would love that. And I'd love to be able to speak other languages fluently, which is not a skill I have.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you for participating in our lightning round. We are now going into segment 3, which is, again, my favorite part. We get to hear from Bloom Energy employees with their questions, either texting to my phone or in the chat box. We're going to start with one in the chat box from Kashal Biligiri. Congresswoman Lofgren, thank you for championing HR 3648. The Eagle Act, and introducing it in the House. When can we expect the bill to make its way to the House floor and the Senate? And for everyone participating, feel free to share a little bit more about the Eagle Act.
Well, let me just very quickly explain what it is. Current immigration law is really a mess. And the way we allocate visas, first you have to qualify for a permanent residence visa on the business side. Your prospective employer has to go through a big exercise to prove that there is no one here who's capable of doing the job that you've been offered. And it's merit-based, as you can see. Of course, once that merit-based decision has been made, then the visas are allocated based on the country you're born in, which is insane. So large countries like India, where a very large number of highly educated, highly skilled people want to come and become Americans, is hugely disadvantaged over Western Europe, to the point where we have people in EB2, the second category, who are facing a wait for a visa number that is close to 100 years. Obviously, you die before your visa number comes up. So for several years, I've tried to do a bill that would do some reallocation between the countries so that we could sort of break the logjam. We had a markup. A markup is where you put the bill up in committee and you take amendments and you take votes and vote it out. We did report the bill out, but here's the bad news. We did not get a single vote from Republicans on the committee. And worse than that, they ranted and railed about how horrible this was. And so I'm really, I don't know how we move forward. If we don't get any Republican support, I don't know how we get it through the Senate and maybe not even through the House. So it was very disappointing. Some of the advocates had indicated that, several Republican members had assured them that they were going to vote yes, but when it came down to the vote, they all voted against it.
That is such a switch from how immigration was viewed even a decade or two ago.
Not be that way.
No, it shouldn't. And thanks for continuing the fight. KR, if we could ask for your comments, if you don't mind. You were not born in this country. Raised in an agricultural community in India. Can you tell us about your experience coming here and that immigration process?
Look, I think it was a very different time. And the notion of, it's not just me from India, but having come in as an international student to a large land grant university where a lot of the graduate students came from so many parts of the world. I think the common story that you would hear is these were some of the best and the brightest in their countries. Mm-hmm. And they all, because they were not only very good at what they do, but they also had that sense of adventure, wanted to go out and see what else can be done. So it was that intersection of those two things, which creates the entrepreneurial mindset, which creates the Lewis and Clark explorer kind of stuff, going back to how the early explorers. They in some way to me represented that kind of a spirit, and that's true. When I read now about American history, that's true about practically every generation, and it was from some other country. It happens to be India. In this generation, it was Irish. It was so you can go back to whenever it is, and each one of those waves made this a better country, right? And the people understood that. The policymakers understood that. the universities, there were multiple things that happened in the university because of that. It not only brought good students, it made the entire class a lot better. It made the domestic students, the exposure for them, the way it pushes the bar. The domestic students pushed us, we pushed them. Together, we were better off than we had been independently doing anything ourselves, right? It's that combination of diversity builds strength that immigration brings. And yeah, I took one job away.
And how many of you created KR?
Created thousands.
So that's the point. And so that's the way to think about it.
Well said. Thank you.
Can I just say how what KR is saying is absolutely the case. Our country is so strengthened and enriched by immigration. And it is a huge disappointment to me to get this negative reaction on the other side of the aisle. Now, it's true, if you look back in our history, there have been anti-immigrant moments. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had no Irish need apply. But overall, the policymakers have had an understanding that this country was made by immigrants, and to have the organized opposition is depressing. I just introduced another bill that we had put in the Build Back Better provision that as an alternative to the reallocating visas, we would simply say, if you are approved for a visa, you're in the United States and you waited for more than 2 years, you can pay an accelerated fee and adjust. So that's another alternative. It's not up to me what goes to the House floor, but I'm trying to put different options so that we can make progress on this for the House leadership to figure out.
Thank you. Well, as the child of grandparents who were immigrants from Italy, who had WAP without papers stamped on they came into this country, I thank you for your diligence in moving this forward. It's not only brains, it's brawn that built this country, and immigrants have provided both. We have so many great questions. I'm going to dive back in, and again, people can put it into the Q&A box, the chat box, as well as right to my phone. I've had several in each of these mechanisms. The next one is from Tanya Peacock, who is our California Senior Director for Government Affairs and Policy. Congresswoman Lofgren, thank you for joining us today and for your work supporting science, infrastructure, and immigration. Hydrogen companies and stakeholders in California are excited about the $8 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure bill for clean hydrogen hubs. Right now, there are several teams in California that have formed to put together applications. What approach do you think would best position California to be successful in securing one of the at least 4 hydrogen hub grants, separate competing applications within California, or a statewide approach?
Well, that's a very good question. As I mentioned, I chair the California Democratic delegation, and this was a topic of discussion at our meeting the week before last. Concern was expressed by some members that the state of California has not leapt ahead in this application process. So the delegation has reached out to the governor's office to see how we might coordinate with them to take a more aggressive approach to getting some of these grants in California. First, we need the applications. So I'll just invite those who are putting the applications together to be in touch with me and other members of the delegation so that we can encourage the governor's office to be aggressive. And I think once the applications are made, the delegation needs to step forward as one to support them. And of course, one member of our delegation who goes to all of our meetings is a Speaker of the House. So I'm sure she will be very vocal as well. And obviously, they have to be good applications. They're not going to be approved based on politics. But once great applications are in, we need to show political support.
So would it be helpful? Would it be helpful if the state is able to say that they will put some of their state dollars into this too.
I'm sure it wouldn't hurt. It wouldn't hurt. But I
And
think more than that, it's the plan. I mean, we need to have, in a way, it's similar to electric charging stations. There needs to be adequate development of the hydrogen blueprint for this to work. And that really takes a public-private partnership to make that work.
Well said. And it's good to see that the governor is serious about helping to fund such an effort as well. We have several more questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can in the next 2 to 3 minutes tops. This one is, what are your top priorities for the year ahead, so 2022, as you listen to your constituents in the 19th Congressional District?
Well, my constituents have a variety of concerns. One issue that everyone talks about is housing, the cost of housing, and a related issue of homelessness. For a long time, Silicon Valley just didn't take steps to house its workforce. And I think that is starting to change. There are a lot of projects that have been developed here in San Jose, approved. And of course, Google's new campus, 25,000 people, they've pledged to build enough housing themselves to house their entire workforce. So that is a big change and very important. When it comes to homelessness, obviously it's not just the lack of housing, although it is that, but there are people on the street with a whole variety of other problems, people with behavioral health problems, addiction. And my constituents are talking about, why are we allowing people to be out on the street and not receiving the treatment resources that they so obviously need? And I think that's not something the federal government does directly, but working with our state and local partners, that has to be forthcoming. And I know Supervisor Chavez has been leading the effort on the Board of Supervisors in terms of bringing those resources, and in some cases mandating that those resources be provided to people who are in have no capacity because of their disabilities to even realize that they are in need of that assistance. In the House of Representatives, I have a whole variety of science issues I want to get done. But let me just say, I want to get immigration reform done. Even if we can't get everything done, I want significant progress made on that. I am so frustrated that we have not been able to improve such a dysfunctional system that it's doing such damage to the country. So that's a major goal that I have. And to finish the January 6th Select Committee investigation in a way that is thorough, honest, and digestible to the American people.
Well said on all fronts. And I'm so glad you mentioned the challenging issue of homelessness, the work that Supervisor Chavez has done. I remember back in 2016, when she led a county proposition Measure A, a $950 million homelessness and affordable housing bond that has already led to 4,400 homes for people who are homeless or who need homes that are deeply affordable in just the first 6 years of that program. And leadership like that has just been amazing. I'm going to sneak in one more question, and we'll almost do it in a lightning round format, Congressmember Lofgren, and this is a tough one for a lightning round. What are the challenges or opportunities you see as you work with your fellow members of Congress? Perhaps one opportunity, one challenge.
Well, we have an opportunity on the January 6th committee. It's bipartisan, and really it's the only committee I've served on in the House where every single member is pulling in the same direction. There's no fighting, there's no undercutting, there's no partisan agendas. It's all to stand up for the Constitution and do the right thing for our country. So that's a great opportunity that I've had. Challenges, the partisanship is extreme, And in the case of some of my colleagues, extreme is not an adequate word to describe some of my colleagues who are white supremacists. And I mean, they just live in, I don't know what planet they're inhabiting, but it's not the same reality that you and I are in. It makes it very difficult to find common ground when you're not living on the same planet.
Thank you for finding solutions in such a challenging environment. We are so fortunate by your leadership. Part of my, one of my favorite elements of our Empowered Community Bloom Energy employee town halls is that we pick 2 employees at Bloom to share for about 45 seconds each the nuggets they heard from this conversation and what they will take away from this session with 2 such articulate, thoughtful, and effective leaders. So I'm going to ask first Janine Stanislaw from our Human Resources and Recruiting team, and then Megan Rakoff from our Sustainability team to share their nuggets. Janine?
Thanks so much, Carl. I wanted to first off thank you so much, Congressmember Lofgren and KR, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been really interesting. I'm appreciative. And what really stuck with me is the alignment of interests and values of Bloom with that of the state of California. And of course, Congressmember Lofgren, your work on behalf of the state, specifically around pragmatic response to climate change, supporting science and scientists, immigration reform, and a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It just really hit home with me how audacious our goals are as a state and as a company, and how important and meaningful our work is on behalf of both. As a bloomer, it really feels good to be a part of a company that's tackling these problems and challenges. So again, thank you so much to both of you for sharing your knowledge.
Janine, thank you. And thanks for joining us today. Megan Rakoff, if you could turn on your camera and turn off your mute button.
Yes, thank you, Carl. I want to mirror Janine's words about, I just want to thank KR and Congresswoman Lofgren for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been really informative. And a couple things that stuck with me over this conversation was just the way that everything that KR and Congresswoman Lofgren said, they kind of mirrored their opinions on the topics such as California's historic drought. Congresswoman Lofgren, really stated the need for us to focus on wildfire prevention and invest in technologies that can create long-term solutions for this issue, such as satellite imagery, firefighting drones, which I had never heard of, and then lifting the cap on firefighters' pay, which I did not know that existed also. So, and then KR mentioned, adaptive technologies such as Bloom that really get to the decarbonization solutions that are necessary to prevent these future wildfires and climate change. So I think that, with long-term solutions like Bloom and the short-term solutions like the wildfire prevention technologies, they both mirror each other's words that we need to focus on short and long-term solutions. So that was what stuck with me from this conversation.
Megan Rakoff, Janine Stanislas, thank you for joining us and for sharing your takeaways. Dr. KR Sridhar, Congressmember Zoe Lofgren, what an honor and how inspiring it's been to hear you both today. If you'll look down at your clock, you'll notice it's 1 o'clock. We have a tradition at Bloom. We start on time, we end on time, and we respect your time. So this is the conclusion of our Empowered Communities Bloom Energy Employee Town Hall. Thank you to all of our colleagues who have participated, especially our 2 special guests. And as I like to say, now team, get back to work. Thank you all.
Thank you, Carl.
Thanks a lot, Carl. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.